I am not the biggest fan of Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, and ever since its release 12 years ago, I've been trying to understand exactly why it just didn't gel with me, only for me to haphazardly discover the secret in an alternate universe book that pretty much nobody talks about anymore. DC's Earth One Imprint was, without getting into the details of multiple Crisis events, it was the company's answer to Marvel's Ultimate Universe, only 10 years late, and is somewhat similar to what DC's doing now with the Absolute Universe, which itself is sort of a response to Marvel's new Ultimate Universe. I love how much time repeats itself. Basically, some of DC's most iconic characters would be given modern reinterpretations that are all set in a new connected universe, giving them altered origins and storylines with absolutely no connections to the Earth that we know, while also having the added benefit of realism, because the realistic superhero shtick was very popular in that era, especially at DC. And the imprint kicked off with our subject of today, Superman Earth One, released in 2010, written by J. Michael Straczynski and illustrated by Shane Davis. And it would eventually end with Wonder Woman Earth One, and that book is its own can of worms. It actually ended with Batman Volume 3, I think. I have so many problems with Wonder Woman Earth 1. Yeah, the quality graph for these comics was kind of all over the place, and the universe would just pretty much be ignored for the most part in the years to come. But Superman Earth 1, all things considered, was a promising beginning to a new universe, and just a good Superman comic. Shane Davis's realistic art style allows for the alien invasion in the third act to have a lot more weight than your average issue of, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, but I do think that his style does bristle with the Superman setting, with some panels feeling so somber when I don't think that they intended to, or just being a bit off-putting visually. The first volume is a short read and told a pretty decent story of a young adult Clark Kent who goes to Metropolis, unsure what to do with his life, until aliens invade and he finally becomes Superman. However, as I read this modern retelling of Kal-El's origin, I was astounded by how close this was to Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, a movie that would release only 3 years after this volume came out. Yeah, Earth One comics are graphic novels that would only be released in trade paperback form every few years or so. Volume 2 actually released in 2012, knee-deep into principal photography for Man of Steel, so we're really only talking about the first volume here. Also, this is not to say that Superman Earth 1 was the only inspiration that Goyer and Snyder had for their reboot. Despite it not seeming like it at first, Man of Steel actually took inspiration from a ton of comics. Superman Going Around the World is taken directly from Superman Birthright. The conversation between Clark and Jonathan Kent where John reassures Clark that,
"You are my son,"
is almost completely paraphrased from Superman's Secret Origin. Plus, there's a couple other things that I probably didn't notice, I don't know. I lead a busy life. But even with just 130-ish pages, the inspiration taken from Earth 1 is not just a singular scene or an idea. The very basis of the story, down to the structure of Earth 1's narrative, is mirrored in Man of Steel. The present-day story of an adult Clark Kent slowly becoming Superman is contrasted and, in some ways, amplified by the flashbacks of his childhood with Ma and Pa Kent until he finally recognizes his Kryptonian heritage right around the time that Metropolis is invaded. His Fortress of Solitude here is really just a crashed Kryptonian ship in the Arctic. There's a heavy military presence in the story, although I think Man of Steel's reasoning for that was a bit more on the business side of things. The villain sending a message across the Earth right before his army invades Metropolis also comes from Earth 1. The sequence with the world engine is taken straight from the page. Superman's fight with Tyrell, that's the villain's name. It's Tyrell. Not a really interesting villain name. Oh no, it's my main villain, Benjamin. Superman's fight with Tyrell causes nearly as much, if not more, destruction than before he got involved, so hey, at least Zack Snyder was just being comic accurate here. And the story ends with Clark adopting the iconic glasses and finally getting a job at the Daily Planet along with Lois, Perry, and Jimmy. Reading this comic illuminated a lot of the issues that I had with Man of Steel, pun intended. It allowed me to see what might have inspired Goyer and Snyder, what they changed, what they added, and why I think it didn't land. Case in point, Jonathan Kent kinda sucks in Man of Steel, going so far as to suggest that his preteen son should have just let his classmates drown, and even prevents his son from saving himself, all because John is afraid of how people would react knowing a being like Clark actually exists. In Earth One, while they still urge Clark to be careful with his powers and hide his identity, both John and Martha want Clark to be a superhero. In this origin, Martha is still the one to make Clark's outfit as a teenager. However, the reason why Clark never became Superboy in Earth One is simply because he wanted to be normal. He saw his powers as a detriment and only wanted to use them to help his parents financially, since Clark can excel at almost any job he can think of. It sort of makes sense since in this book, Clark has absolutely no connection or even knowledge of his Kryptonian heritage up until Tyrell tells him who he is. However, the way Man of Steel adapts this complex motivation is by putting all of that want for Clark to be normal onto Jonathan instead, who now is just instilling this fear of what humanity could do into his son, which is supposed to explain why Clark was not Superman before the movie, but it just makes him look like a coward and his dad looks like an asshole. Honestly, Man of Steel kind of comes closer to an allegory for being in the closet with bigoted parents rather than becoming Superman, and it just generally makes Pa Kent into a fucking dick. Speaking of which, his death was entirely original to the movie, and that makes sense because, good lord, that is ridiculous. However, in some ways, I do think that Man of Steel is a bit of an improvement. Crazy, I know. Volume 1 ends with the message from the Kryptonian ship that Clark must avenge his home world Krypton, a place that he has absolutely no connection to whatsoever, and just learned about only a few pages ago. Now, one of my least favorite things about Man of Steel is the 20-minute opening on Krypton. No interpretation has done the destruction of Krypton as well as a Superman animated series, and for that reason I never want to see it ever again, especially if it's going to be this drab and smeared in visual effects. However, as much as it pains me, it does sort of serve a purpose here. By having AI Jor-El show up in the ship, sure, it gives a MacGuffin for how both Kal-El and Lois are able to save the day, but it also allows Clark to form his own connection with Krypton and his heritage directly through his father, one that's immediately juxtaposed by Zod and his zealotry, which is another great change. As I implied earlier, the villain in Earth 1, Volume 1, is an original antagonist who initially seems like Brainiac, but he's actually Tyrell, who's the leader of a rival alien planet who is also somehow responsible for the destruction of Krypton. And all of this means absolutely nothing to Clark, who's simply fighting this androgynous alien because he's attacking a city of innocent people. This can kind of be excused since there's 2 other books to expand on this story, but by changing the antagonist to a character like Zod, it makes for a much better standalone narrative. By watching the droning, boring flashback, we learn that he's a man who is tied to Jor-El, both in life and in death. A man whose sole purpose for the past 3 decades has been to recreate Krypton at any price whatsoever, and it makes it feel a lot more cohesive thematically, with Zod being a physical representation of Krypton's hubris, and that's pretty good. I will say, despite the rest of the main cast feeling off, Zod is the best part of Man of Steel, and pretty much all that is owed to Michael Shannon. But hey, Zack Snyder, why is Zod encased in a black dildo? However, while I like parts of this comic, there is one fundamental problem with Superman Earth 1 that is ironically very accurately adapted into Man of Steel, and that has to be the complete misunderstanding and disillusion of one key character, which is Clark Kent himself. Sure, there's other characters that both of these stories kind of mess up in my opinion, Lois being a main one, and the problem with these interpretations of Clark Kent isn't like the newest Superman movie where that portion of his life is simply underrepresented. No. In both Man of Steel and Earth One, Clark just doesn't feel like a person. Across these 2 stories, practically every conversation Clark has roots back to his alien heritage. Whether it's about hiding his powers, or how alone he feels, or how afraid people would be if he showed the public what he could really do. It's almost like Clark Kent himself is written like an alien. Like a gray, bug-eyed alien. For all intents and purposes, Clark Kent is a regular boy from rural Kansas, who just so happens to gain powers in his teenage years, or he's always had them depending on what interpretation you're reading. But with Earth 1, and especially Man of Steel, Clark isn't allowed to have emotions, or ambitions, or feelings beyond his struggle with hiding his powers. Earth One's Clark kinda has some additional depth where he's grieving at his father's grave, checking in on his widowed mother, as well as his quarter-life crisis where he feels lost and unsure of what to do, but even then, the latter is only because he's so great at everything that all of these jobs are just so dull. At one point he even gloats that he could find a cure for a disease, as if he's talking about math homework, which again makes it feel like we, the audience, are only able to observe Clark through an opaque pane of glass. The setup of Volume 1 bears some similarity to the pilot of The Adventures of Lois and Clark, but since that show was going more for the soap opera, melodrama crowd, it allowed Clark to be characterized as a person, one who, despite all his powers, still goes through everyday life from applying to jobs to dealing with workplace romance. While both Earth One and Man of Steel write Clark with a sense of gravitas. He's always got a brooding demeanor that comes from just how difficult it is to be so damn perfect all the time. And not only is that a step too far away from the character that we know, but it's fucking boring. If you're insufferable enough to go to film school like I did, then you've probably seen Kill Bill Volume 1 and Volume 2. And even though there are a lot of choices in Volume 2 that will render it an inferior movie in many eyes, get it? One of my least favorite scenes ever is Bill's interpretation of Superman.
When Superman wakes up in the morning, he's Superman. His alter ego is Clark Kent. Glasses, the business suit. That's the costume. He's weak, he's unsure of himself, he's a coward. Clark Kent is Superman's critique on the whole human race.
As a teenager, this frustrated me beyond belief, but it didn't take me long to rationalize it as, oh, he's the villain, so of course he'd claim to be a fan of Superman, only to completely misunderstand the book. Of course someone like Bill would automatically think that a person with power like that would look at those without it as weak. But the older I get, the more I realize that some people probably watched that scene and went, damn, he's gotta spit in facts! Both interpretations of the character come to the conclusion that the Clark Kent persona is a farce, simply created by Kal-El to blend into Metropolis. Which, sure, that's part of it. He has to keep his identity secret, but that doesn't mean that Clark is a disguise and Superman is the real person. They're all him. Kal-El, Clark Kent, Superman, they're the same person. I'm sure depending on the comic that you read, Clark will present himself as overly clumsy or even airheaded, simply to keep Lois off of the trail, but great comics will often still incorporate parts of who he is in that disguise. So this idea that Kal-El doesn't naturally smile or have any complex emotions beyond frustration or sadness unless he's playing the character of Clark Kent or Superman is frankly ridiculous. And to me, it always comes back to that sickness of realism. It's not lost on me that Man of Steel was both inspired and originally meant to be a part of the Nolan Batman universe, whose scripts were also penned by David S. Goyer. And as much as those movies work to focus on the gritty crime part of the character, it suffocates the kind of stories that can be told in such a grounded, realistic universe. And honestly, having that same outlook for Superman is sort of a death sentence for your story. When talking about reinterpreting Superman in a 2013 world, Goyer himself said, "It just struck me that there is an idealist quality to the Donner films that may or may not work with today's audience." End quote. That idealist quality Goyer's referencing is, mind you, ultimately the core of what makes Superman so different from the rest of the genre. He is your favorite superhero's favorite superhero. I think it all makes sense when you realize what year these stories came out, 2010 and 2013 respectively, during a time where comic books and general geek culture wasn't just niche anymore, it was mainstream, and it was lucrative, and there was still a general sense of scrubbing away the weird parts in order to make it palatable to general audiences, especially when you take into account how culturally relevant Richard Donner's Superman movies were and the sequels to follow it, how middling Superman Returns was, and how little of a cultural standpoint the character had in the 2010s outside of being mischaracterized as a boring Boy Scout. Ultimately, both stories ask why Superman is the way he is, and I think that the conclusions they come to, while ultimately different, still look at the character through the same postmodern lens that sort of scoffs in the face of the campiness of the character. And ultimately, both stories resort to bringing a larger-than-life hero down to our level, ironically robbing him of both his complexity and his vulnerability. And that makes these stories a lot more alike than you'd think. Or Maybe Zack Snyder just really wanted to have a Dragon Ball Z fight for like 30 minutes. I forgot that third act goes on for like 40 fucking minutes. It's so long.
Want to sit by the kitchen?
No.
No, you don't. I mean, how can they put this much mayonnaise on tuna fish and expect people to eat it?
Why do you care? You're invulnerable to harm.
It's not harm. It's too rich. Makes me queasy.
Send it back.
Ah,
You got a little... napkin?
why? It's impervious to stain.